All right. Yeah. It should be an interesting, this is going to be a much better conversation than I've had sometimes in the past, right? So that always makes me feel better. First off, when we think about it from 2023, we saw meat supply basically down a little bit in the whole. When we look at all the combinations between poultry, pork, and beef, we saw that meat supply, we didn't produce as much meat altogether in 23 as what we did in 2022. So what does that mean? When I first look at it from a consumption side, right, from a demand side, when we're looking at it for poultry, you could see that we were down a little bit here, even though we actually saw 23 production of poultry up about 1.3%. We actually consumed less in the United States. Most of that had to do with because we did see an increase in exports. I'll go over exports specifically, but we saw that basically where we saw that increase in exports, which meant we had a little bit less here in retail shelves in the United States. We saw the retail price basically of poultry up about 3% in 23 relative to 22. When you look at it, we're still, obviously, poultry is still obviously the lowest priced of all of our proteins relative to pork or beef, which the beef is the blue line up there, the red is the pork, and then the dotted line is the poultry line where you can look at it from there. When we look at from a price adjustment point, we've seen significant increases, but poultry is actually the one that's had some of the least amount of increases over time relative to beef or pork. When we look at pork consumption, basically, again, in 23, we saw a little bit lower. Our production was pretty stable, but because of the increase in exports that we saw, we actually saw, again, a little bit of a decline in retail consumption in the United States here. Retail price for pork, though, was down about 1.1%. So basically, when we're seeing demand going down and the price going down, basically with it, we're seeing basically a little pushback basically on demand for pork here in the United States. So that's really weakened. That's the one where we've seen in our proteins, the demand for pork is the one that's seen the weakest demand in 23. Again, that's where we're looking at it from a demand side for domestically. When we look at beef, we saw significant declines in consumption in the United States. Retail price for beef was up about 3.9% relative to 2022. The biggest thing is, though, even though we saw consumption for beef down, this is actually really surprising. And it's this amount of consumption and the price here actually surpassed a lot of expectations, meaning that demand is much stronger for beef than what we were expecting. We saw significant declines in production in beef, and the fact that we are still consuming this much, meaning that we did not export as much of that, and the price of there, we're still keeping a really strong demand. That's one of the big concerns I'll talk about a little bit here, but basically that's our big concern for when we're looking at for in 2024 is where is that beef demand? Is that going to continue to stay strong? As we look at whether or not we have recession, where we look at for inflation, where we look at for consumer spending and consumer savings is down. All of those impact basically then our meat demand, all right? Beef demand tends to be the one that's impacted the most because it is, as we see, the highest price. So when that impacts it, we look at this. Last year, if you call, I said, oh my gosh, we're going to really see some pushback on beef demand in 23. Guess what? Didn't happen. So I hope it does not happen still in 24, but it is something that we do have to be cautious about whether or not we're going to see some pushback on those high prices. Again, we've had record prices for beef. Record prices were occurred in 2020 at the end of 23 for those beef prices, hitting on an all fresh beef supply price of $7.94. So really, really high prices, but still a lot of demand out there. Where are we headed then? If we're looking at it into 24, well, that's really kind of weird to look at. Our fresh price, we're still going to see high prices of beef up about 4.6%. We'll see pork prices down a little bit in 24, and we'll see poultry prices down a little bit in 24 as well. The biggest concern that we have is, again, whether or not we have weaker domestic demand, which ties in a lot with consumer expectations and whether or not we have savings. All right. Let's look at it from an international side for exports for poultry. Basically, Where we're looking at for broilers, for chicken, basically 2023 exports should finish pretty much on par, just a couple thousand, 100,000 pounds different. So pretty much on par with what we had for 2022. Turkey exports is where we saw the huge basically changes, and these significantly rebounded, where we had an 11.8% increase. A big reason for that is, if you recall, in 22, we had a lot of change of those exports basically based off of avian influenza. Unfortunately, we've had a little bit of an impact on avian influenza at the very end here of 23. So there are some certain areas that have banned basically exports from Ohio and California for poultry at this point. But assuming we can get avian influenza back under control again, and it doesn't go to the point where we saw it in 2022, we should basically see continued increase in exports for poultry in 24. All right. When we're looking at it for pork, they also rebounded in 23 to the point that we saw our exports go up about 5.5% over relative where they were at in 22. A large part of this is basically the lower U.S. prices in relative terms, but also in the idea that it was a lot of having to do with Mexico. 85% of Mexican imports of pork come from the United States. And we saw a big increase in our exports going to Mexico, which really helped significantly on the pork side for our exports here. All right, so that's one thing. We did see some increases as well, I saw a decrease in one of the other markets, which was Japan. But overall, we did see those increases in pork exports, and we should hopefully continue to see that in 24. When we're looking at beef, beef and veal is the way it's reported. So, but beef exports, basically, we saw a significant decrease. Those were down about 14% relative to 2022. And basically, when we look at our imports of beef, which I don't have up here, we imported about 7% more beef into the United States than we did in 22. All right. So remember, what we export and what we import of beef are not the same. All beef is not equivalent. All right. So we tend to export higher valued cuts. We import lean products typically. And so they're not the same thing. What happens is, why are we down so much was a lot to do with, again, supply. We just are not producing as much beef. Couple that with the strong dollar, we saw that decline basically in exports. Where we saw it is in all of our top markets. So Japan, South Korea, China are our top 3 markets. The exports in those countries declined by 17 to 22% in 23 relative to 22. It's still there. It's just that we are not having as much product. That's the biggest issue that we're seeing right now when we're looking at it from the point of view for beef exports. What that means in 24 is we're going to be done again for production. So we will see beef exports continue to decline in 24. So if we continue on that path, it starts to get a little bit of a concerning if these countries start to find product in other places. But right now, it's not too concerning. It's an expectation given where our supply is for beef. When we look at production side, basically poultry, we should continue to see basically some increases in growth here. The biggest thing that we have to worry about, as I said, is whether or not the avian influenza continues. Otherwise, we should see increases both in turkey production. We should look at about a 1.3% in poultry altogether when we combine broilers and turkey. So we should be up about 1.3% there. Basically, where we're looking at it, the biggest thing then is what we're looking at is a pushback on wholesale prices, which is coupling in with those retail prices. So that's where we're looking for 24. It's a little bit of an issue here when we kind of come on the demand challenges. Profitability side for protein has a lot to do with more so of the diseases and whether or not we can continue to control avian influenza. With pork, where are we looking at for production? We should see moderate growth. We have the USDA found a little bit as far as for the breeding herd size here. And then coupled that with the bigger pigs per litter, we should see a moderate growth basically in our pork production in 2024. But where we get with pork production, The bigger concern is what is going to happen with the variability on the market that's related to California's Proposition 12, which is the Farm Animal Confinement Initiative. All right, so in order to be able to sell pork in California, you have to meet the guidelines for production that are under that initiative, which creates a lot of concern because California is the largest state from a retail demand for pork. And as we see the market adjusting to whether or not people can sell pork in California, if it doesn't go there, is it going to the export market? Is it going to retail shelves in other parts, in other states? There's going to create a lot of variability and a lot of uncertainty within that in the United States. All right, so at least through 24. When we're looking at beef then from a production side, as you can see up here, basically when we're looking at it for 23, we basically saw steer slaughter was down, heifer slaughter basically was up, right? And then cow slaughter was basically up. So all that basically, if we're looking at it from a point, total slaughter is down, even though our dress weights were down. So we saw a lot less production of beef in 2023. We will continue to see less beef in 24. Mostly what I want to point out is here is when we look at this, the big thing that we talk about from the beef herd is we have not yet started to grow our beef herd. We still continued to, as you saw, increase our cow slaughter. We still have higher numbers of heifer on feed right now, which means that heifers are there. So we're not holding back those heifers to start growing that herd. So we are continuing to cull and to decline our beef herd. So when we couple all that together, 24, we're going to see another decline in production of about 5.2%. And unless we get weather that's conducive to being able to grow that, we'll see this decline in beef production for a couple of years yet. All right, so that plays into those higher beef prices. Where are we looking at it in Wisconsin? Just to give you an idea, so these are basically changes over the last decade. So total cattle on head recognized, we have total cattle of about 3.4 million cattle. That's all cattle on feed, beef cows, dairy cows, calves, everything. But for the last 10 years, just to give you an idea, we have actually increased our, over 10 years, we're up about 20,000 head. So that's about 7% in increases relative to where we were at 10 years ago, whereas the rest of the nation in that same time for beef cows is down about 3%. So we're kind of bucking the trend when we look at it from a point of view from beef perspective. We're growing that beef cow side a little bit more in Wisconsin relative to the nation. This just gives you some idea. I've talked about all of these, but where I see for prices going, farm prices, production, exports, retail prices for 2024. As I said, I've talked about all of them, but just to kind of give you some idea on expectations, at least in the directional ways for where I see for some of those going. When we're looking at 24, the big things I have that we have to think about, and this was the prices for first cattle, if you want, I don't know, just to give you percentages here, for basically we're up. We should see some profitability in some, at least in beef, provided you've got some control over the prices of your feeder cattle and that. Factors we need to watch: recession, Proposition 12, disease. Those are the issues that are going to be really people are paying attention to in 2024. Thanks.